Hi poetry lovers, welcome to my channel Bella Poetry Presents. In this segment we will continue to discuss romantic poets. And so today we'll be talking about another romantic poet, Robert Southey. And this is his portrait. And I think it's very important. I always show the portrait of different poets because looking at them you can really get an impression who they were, how they were. The portrait does reflect a lot or shows a lot about a human being. So Robert Southey was, as I said before, one of the romantic poems. He's remembered for his long narrative poems and especially the anti-war poem which was titled After Blenheim. We will read this poem at the end of the segment, and you will be surprised to find out that he actually was the original author of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, the famous fairy tale. He was also one of the lake poets. The other two were Coleridge and Wordsworth. The reason they were called lake poets because they lived in the Lake District, all three poets. At the time of his life, when he was alive, Robert Southey was quite famous. He made a living from his poetry, which was not that common during this time. But today he is greatly overshadowed by Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth that are considered much more important than he was. So Robert Southey was born on August 12, 1774 in Bristol and raised through his early years mostly in the city of Bath in England. He attended Westminster School in London, but he criticized the school for excessive corporal punishment. At that time it was accepted that students were hit, sometimes with a ruler, and he was expelled for this criticism. Now, in spite of this situation, he matriculated at Oxford in 1792, living in Balliol College. Here he established the dual interests that would drive his subsequent literary career. He had a precocious ambition and wide-ranging, often arcane erudition. In 1794, he met a poet that would be very influential in his life, whose name was Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He was one of the three lake poets, as we mentioned before. And they shared literary aspirations and radical political views. And together the same year, they wrote a verse drama called The Fall of Robespierre. Southey left Oxford without a degree. And for a time, he was caught with Coleridge in a project which was quite, I would say, insane. This was a man called Joseph Presley immigrated to Pennsylvania in 1794, and he purchased land that Coleridge and Robert decided to build on a utopian agricultural community. And it was in the United States, obviously. And so in 1795, in spite of his collaboration with Coleridge on this utopian community, Southey secretly married Edith Fricker. This was his first wife. And obviously when you get married, you have all kinds of domestic considerations. And so his utopian passions began to dissipate. So he abandoned his commitment to this project, which really kind of affected his friendship with Coleridge, but he decided to mend it by proposing to Coleridge to marry his wife's Edith's sister, whose name was Sarah. So Coleridge and Southey became family, and that kind of mended their relationship. Now, Southey's literary activities continued unabated revealing themselves in numerous short poems, contributed to newspapers and periodicals for a fee. So he was paid for his work, and his prose was actually very, very famous because it was very accurate, very clear, and people commended him on the way he wrote his articles. His epic poem Joan of Arc, in which he expressed strong sympathy for French citizenry defending itself against English aggression. The poem was published in 1796 during the third year of the warfare between the two countries, England and France, when its author was only 21 years old. And because he became the public defense of contemporary France, a defender of a contemporary France, he put himself into a very dangerous situation because defending France at this time in England was considered a treason. Southey's marriage was deeply resented by his aunt who had raised him. And in late 1795, to repair the breach of his relationship between his aunt and himself, he decided to accompany the aunt's husband, his uncle, on a diplomatic appointment to Spain. While there, he engaged in deep study of the literatures of the Iberian Peninsula that would be reflected for years in various his literary projects. He also turned his actual experience to good practical effect, writing a work, Letters Written During the Short Residence of Spain and Portugal, that was published in 1797. Upon his return, he settled in London and began to study law. A lot of poets actually tried to study a profession that would provide a good living for them, but they found that it wasn't for them. Their vocation was poetry. And so that happened to Southey as well. He found that he was unsuited for the profession of a lawyer. In a fortunate intervention beginning in 1797, he started to receive an annuity of £160 that was paid to him for 9 years by an old Westminster school friend, Charles Wynne. This stable income allowed him to finally concentrate on his career as a writer. And in 1797 and 1799, he gathered together his many shorter writings in 2 volumes of collected poems, thereby hoping to consolidate his position as the leading formulator of a revolution in English letters. So in 1800, Southey again accompanied his uncle abroad, this time to Lisbon, Portugal, where the uncle held the office of a chaplain to the British Embassy. By the time of his return, however, he had firmly decided to earn his living as a writer, a project that for his day would have appeared as ambitious and even almost as utopian as the utopian scheme he had outgrown, the one that he started with Coleridge in the United States. Short poems and quasi-popular ballads reflecting a true feeling for rural folk were a staple of his output. He began the long series of editions, for example, the works of the Bristol native Thomas Chatterton, and he also did translations that would mark his career. And he outlined a plan for the exotic Welsh Aztec epic romance that would be published, titled Medoc, in 1805, and completed a verse romance derived from Mohammedan lore that became a bestseller, and it was titled Thalaba the Destroyer, which was published in 1801. In 1803, the Southeys, who had returned to the southwest of England, visited the Coleridges, then living at Greta Hall, Keswick, in the Lake District. The visit transformed himself into a lifelong residence there, where the sisters raised their families together. So if you remember, Edith Southey's wife had a sister, Sarah, who was married to Coleridge. So the two families, Southeys and Coleridges, lived in the same area and raised their children together. So this is the point too at which Southey established a close relationship with William Wordsworth, whose story we discussed in the previous segment. And we remember that Wordsworth lived at the time in Grasmere, which was pretty close to where Southey and Coleridge lived. And so we know that's why the three of them were called the Lake Poets. The Southeys had 7 children of their own. And when Coleridge left his family in 1804 for a 3-year appointment as secretary to the British High Commissioner in Malta, the whole household became economically dependent on Southey's unabating literary endeavors in broad range of fields. So Southey was actually the supporter, the financial supporter of his family and the family of his friend Coleridge. During this period, Southey's politics greatly shifted. If before that he was kind of revolutionary and very radical, he more and more identified with conservative side. The claims on his finances and his early dependence on newspapers and periodicals for revenue made him a natural spokesperson for those causes and quasi-governmental sponsorship of his hyperactive pen. So he wrote a lot, he wrote for many periodicals. He had to make a living not just to support his family, but to support the family of his friend Coleridge. After the Tory Quarterly Review was established in 1808, Southey became a regular reviewer, and he was paid handsomely for each review. He was paid £100, which was per article, which was a sum sufficient at that time to provide a modest means for an entire year. So you can imagine if he wrote 3 articles or 4 articles, he was very well provided. With The Curse of Kehama, which was published in 1810, Southey returned to the form of exotic verse romance, this time exploding Indian mythology. It became another bestseller, so greatly revered, for instance, by the young Percy Bysshe Shelley, that in 1812, in search of a literary father figure, Shelley came to reside in Keswick with his young bride, Harriet. Now, I do have a segment about Shelley, Percy Shelley, who was a very controversial figure. If you remember, I hope that you listened to this, the first segment, the first series, the Victorian female poets of 19th century, and then the best love poetry, and these two series talk about many Victorian era poets. And so I talk about Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley's wife after he left Harriet. Harriet was his first wife. He had 2 children with her, and Harriet committed suicide by drowning in River Thames in London. And Percy Shelley was very revolutionary. He came from a noble family, and his father disowned him, and he had nothing to live on. And he died also very young. He drowned in a boat crash wreck in the in Italy. And but he was very revolutionary, and but when he arrived to meet Southey, he became very disappointed because Southey became a conservative and Shelley was very radical, and so their differences were so sharp that after a month Shelley and Harriet moved on. The next year, in 1813, Southey was appointed Poet Laureate through the influence of Walter Scott, who had himself turned down the appointment, a position he would hold. Southey, he would hold this position for the next 30 years. The literary generation in which Mary Shelley and her husband took part also saw Southey as the prime example of literary talent that could be bought. So they didn't approve of Southey because they felt that he conceded to the government, that he became a conservative, and so they didn't respect him. But Southey also had to think about his family in his defense, and he had to make a living. So you can explain why he decided not to go against the government like Percy Shelley and Coleridge. The paradox is that as the years went on, his own politics were increasingly more reactionary than was the government he represented, and his staunchly opposed the middle-class reforms that ushered in a new polity in the late 1820s and 1830s. Now, the last year of his life were very difficult, the last years, we would say. His wife, Edith, suffered from a mental condition, from insanity, and she had to be institutionalized. And finally, she passed away. And then he married a much younger woman, also a poet. Her name was Caroline Bowell Southey. And after he married her, he started to also decline mentally and physically. And finally, Southey passed away on March 21st, 1843 in Cumberland. He was 69 years old. And today I will read just one of his, I usually read two poems, but in this segment I only read one poem that was published in 1798. It was one of his most famous poems. It's quite long, so I'm only going to read one. It's called After Blenheim, which I mentioned before. Okay. It was a summer evening. Old Caspar's work was done, and he, before his cottage door, was sitting in the sun. And by him sported on the green his little grandchild Wilhelmine. She saw her brother Peterkin roll something large and round, which he beside the rivulet in playing there had found. He came to ask what he had found that was so large and smooth and round. Old Caspar took it from the boy, who stood expectant by, and then the old man shook his head, and with a natural sigh, "'Tis some poor fellow's skull," said he, "who fell in the great victory. I find them in the garden, for there is many hereabout, and often when I go to plough, the ploughshare turns them out. For many thousand men," said he, "were slain in that great victory." "Now tell us what 'twas all about, young Peterkin," he cries, and little Wilhelmine looks up with wonder-waiting eyes. "Now tell us all about the war, and what they fought each other for." "It was the English," Caspar cried, "who put the French to rout, but what they fought each other for, I couldn't well make out. But everybody said," quoth he, "'twas was a famous victory. My father lived in Blenheim then. Yon little stream hard by, they burnt his dwelling to the ground, and he was forced to fly. So with his wife and child he fled, nor had the where to rest his head. With fire and sword the country round was wasted far and wide, and many a childing mother then and newborn baby died. I'm sorry, I kind of lost the place. But things like that, you know, must be at every famous victory. They say it was a shocking sight after the field was won, for many thousand bodies here lay rotting in the sun. But things like that, you know, must be after a famous victory. Great praise the Duke of Marlborough won, and our good Prince Eugene. Why, 'twas a very wicked thing, said little Wilhelmine. Nay, nay, my little girl, quoth he, it was a famous victory. And everybody praised the Duke, who this great fight did win. But what good came of it at last, quoth little Peterkin. Why that, I cannot tell, said he, but 'twas a famous victory. So Robert Southey ballad offers a particular perspective on one of the most famous battles of the 18th century. In 1704, in the War of the Spanish Succession, a coalition of forces, including the English, defeated the French and Bavarian armies at Blenheim. Southey does not describe the battle directly, but through the conversation between an old farmer and his grandchildren, it gradually emerges that the setting is a former battleground. Peterkin has found something large and round, which his grandfather explains is a skull, one of the many to be found in the earth nearby, which is, this poem is a stark example of, or testimony to the fact that war is very futile, and many times people don't even know what they're fighting for. So this brings us to the end of this segment. It kind of was a very long segment, but I hope you enjoyed learning about Robert Southey. These people were important in their time, and I think it's important to remember their names. And I hope you enjoyed this poem. Thank you so much for listening. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next week. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. Bye-bye.